I'm Chris Farrell, and this is On Watch. Welcome to On Watch, everybody, the Judicial Watch podcast, where we take a deep dive on topics that the mainstream media would rather not cover or discuss, where we try to recover some lost history and explain the inexplicable. We really appreciate you joining us and taking the time out of your day to either watch us on YouTube or Rumble or listen to our podcast on any of the audio podcast platforms that are out there, whether it's Spotify or any of the other ones. Please be sure to subscribe to us, leave us a rating, and leave us a comment as well. A great treat for you today. We're going to get inside scoop from the Washington Times White House correspondent, Jeff Mordock. Welcome, Jeff Mordock, to On Watch.
Thanks for having me, Chris. Really appreciate it.
You're very welcome. Jeff, you've written a very interesting piece just in the last couple of days that caught my attention, and it has to do with President Biden's conduct, his deportment, his demeanor, how he communicates. And the word that comes to mind, or that you discussed in your article, was confabulation. Talk to us about confabulation and President Biden.
So I don't know if I'm sure most people have noticed, President Biden always tells tall tales or exaggerated tales. It's really ramped up in the last couple of months. So much so that there was an event in Milwaukee earlier this month where he told 4 tales that have been widely debunked. He talked about his grandfather dying in the hospital room where he was born. I think the day or two before he was born, his grandfather died when he was about 2. He told a story about an Amtrak conductor and a conversation he had that took place 20 years after this guy retired and a year after the guy died.
Right.
He told a story about his dad not being able to go to college when his dad spent a year at Johns Hopkins. He told a story about him and his dad encountering a same-sex couple that had been debunked. And he told a story about watching the Pittsburgh bridge collapse when multiple records show he was in Pittsburgh hours after it collapsed.
Right. And then there's corn pop.
Yes,
right? So,
exactly.
I mean, this is an endless stream of, it's really nonsense. I mean, Biden has always had a reputation of kind of putting his foot in his mouth and saying kind of wacky stuff. But as you have pointed out, in the recent past, exponentially an increase in exaggeration, hyperbole, embroidery around stuff. Where did you go when you wrote this article? How did you lay this out?
Well, what I thought was kind of interesting is it seemed to me that there was a reason why these stories, because there's lies presidents tell, like that they've lowered inflation by X amount when it's really a different amount, or they've added so many jobs when the real amount is much lower.
Right.
But what I found interesting is in these stories, I don't know what the benefit is. It's not, lying, it's not exaggerating about job creation or deficit reduction. It's just these bizarre stories that nobody's going to vote for him one way or another. Nobody's going to vote for him. It doesn't connect him to the crowd at all to tell people he witnessed the Pittsburgh bridge collapse.
Right.
There's that his grandfather died in the same hospital room he was born in. That doesn't advance any of his goals. It's just a weird story.
But it seems to matter to him very much.
Exactly.
Because he does this kind of stuff. This is not a one-off. He does this kind of stuff over and over and over again. I mean, can he help himself? What is the nature of this?
Well, to your point, two points on that. To your point, a great example of that is the Amtrak story I referenced about an Amtrak conductor coming and talking to him and telling him that he rode more miles on Amtrak than he did on Air Force Two. And that story has been widely debunked.
Right.
Jen Psaki had been asked why he keeps telling that story. Corinne Jean-Pierre has been asked why he keeps telling that story. He's told that story more than 10 times as president. By my count, at least 10 times. I'm sure I'm missing 1 or 2 times that he's told that story.
Yeah.
So it's interesting that I'm sure there are people telling him, don't keep telling this story. And he keeps telling that story. He told the story in Milwaukee. A week later, he goes to Park City, Utah, repeats the story. And one of the things I thought was really interesting is in the Milwaukee telling, he says, I don't want to mention the conductor because I might get him in trouble. The conductor's been dead for about a decade.
Jeez. This is, I mean, pardon my colloquialism or my outburst, but I mean, this is nuts. This is truly aberrant behavior. This isn't just a gaffe or an inappropriate comment. This is truly nuts.
Well, it's confabulation is what it is, which I know you asked me that at the beginning, and I'm finally around to it. So what confabulation is it's a neurological disorder. It's common in elderly. It's common in dementia patients. It's common in people who've had some sort of brain trauma, which, as we know, the president's had 2 life-threatening aneurysms in the 80s. It's common in people with aneurysms. And what it is it's your brain is trying to tell a story. But because of whatever trauma you have, be it dementia, be it the aneurysm, be it some kind of PTSD, be it all of that, your brain can't think of what happened in that story. So your brain starts immediately making things up. And because it's a way for the brain to protect itself, that the brain doesn't know what to do when it can't come up with the answer and it can't come up with the solution and it can't remember what happened. So it just starts making things up. And I think that's what we're seeing, because he'll start on this. I mean, he's talking about infrastructure and he's talking about the pits, and they can be spontaneous. That's the other thing about confabulation, is it's a neurological disorder. It's also a spontaneous one. And I think that's what we see. He's talking about the infrastructure, his infrastructure law. He's going on about, bridges. He brings up the Pittsburgh Bridge, talks about why that's an example of the infrastructure law, and then throws this wild aside that he witnessed it collapse. It had nothing to do with the main story. It was spontaneous. I'm sure that's not on the pre-written remarks. I'm positive it's not on the pre-written remarks.
So, I mean, and as you're describing this and explaining it, I'm actually sort of catching myself, because one part of me finds it amusing because it's just kind of wacky. Another part of me finds it sort of frustrating because, like you said, this is something that goes on and on. Yeah. But really, on further consideration and thinking about what you just described, this is actually very dangerous.
Well, it's very scary, because one of the things, going back to us talking about the Amtrak, that he has told this story at least 10 times,
right.
That the White House has been pressed why he keeps telling it. It's widely debunked. One of the signs of confabulation is you cannot be convinced otherwise. If your mind and your brain has decided this story is true or aspects of the story are true, then your mind cannot be changed. That is what happened. If, for example, you watch something on TV, but your brain has convinced yourself you watched it in person, nobody and no amount of evidence can ever convince you otherwise.
So we can only hope that he doesn't convince himself of something that's a national security issue, because he would feel compelled to act on some misapprehension of an attack or of a missile launch, or because you couldn't get him away from that then mentally.
Right, but what's so interesting about it is they never, with confabulation, and I've talked to a bunch of psychiatrists and clinicians for this story, it never borders on the fantastical or the absurd. It's never, somebody who's making up a story is never going to make up a story, I had breakfast with Jesus this morning. It's going to be rooted in truth, it's going to be real, and it's just going to be tweaked slightly to convince yourself that this happened. So you're never going to come out and say something fantastical and absurd, but you will come out and say, I saw this in person when you saw it on TV.
So there's always an element of truth or a nugget of reality in there. It's just that they embroider around the story or
embellish it, exactly. Yeah. And it's embellished because they're struggling to come up with the facts.
And you said that you consulted with experts on this. What sort of people did you talk to who have knowledge of this kind of disorder?
Psychiatrist. I talked to a psychiatrist, and then I talked to a clinician in Houston who has written several papers on confabulation. And it's interesting because her work and her study focuses on confabulation in the criminal defense element, because that's where it comes up a lot of times, because people under pressure, people not getting a lot of sleep tend to confabulate. And somebody might be trying to help the police, but the police are really grilling them. They've never been questioned by the police before. They're struggling to come up with an answer, and they're under so much pressure to come up with an answer, their brain starts making up facts.
Making stuff
I can't remember what car the bank robber drove away in. It's a red car, and that's not what they drove away in. But
they feel compelled to fill in the blank somehow.
Right. Their brain is under pressure. Their brain is under stress to come up with something, and it responds by just making up a memory, making up a thought.
And so this isn't not necessarily tied to age, but I believe that age would be a contributing factor.
That's exactly right. It is not like young people being questioned by the police. They can confabulate, but yes, as you get older, it's more common. And as I said, people with dementia, it's more common. People with brain injury, it's more common. People with stressful jobs, it's more common. People with lack of sleep, it's more common. So there are factors, and if you look at, one of the things that I find really interesting is where confabulation is very seriously linked is vascular dementia. And vascular dementia is a form of dementia in which the blood from the heart is not getting up to the brain at the rate that it should. Okay. And that's causing people to be forgetful and not remember things. We know, because this appeared in the president's physical back in February, he does have some heart issues. He does have some, he had a couple of serious heart issues. So that raises, is this a function of blood not going to the brain?
Right.
We don't know. And just also, while we're talking about what his doctor said in the physical report, there's no indication that he took any kind of cognitive test, any kind of dementia test. There's no indication that any sort of mental evaluation was performed when he did his physical back in February. It was all physical. It was all a physical examination.
Now, when it comes to cognitive abilities, I mean, in my personal opinion, and I'm certainly no expert, I mean, I can see a decline in his overall ability to deal with things and his interactions, his comments. Sometimes he's just completely, I mean, this isn't confabulation. It's just he doesn't know what's going on around him, which is different. He seems confused and befuddled, which is different than confabulation. He's not making up fanciful stories. He just doesn't know what the heck is going on around him.
Well, I think it's weird. Have you ever noticed he never seems to know which way to go after finishing a speech?
Right.
He always seems to be struggling, looking for which way to go.
Right.
One of the things that one of the psychiatrists I interviewed for my story had brought up, which I thought was really interesting, is this an example of both confabulation and possibly dementia? Is if you remember in Maui, and you have people here, I mean, there's over 115 people dead, 800 people missing. Lives are completely devastated.
Yes.
And he's talking about this kitchen fire he had in Delaware, at his home in Delaware 20 years ago. There's two things on that. One is that's an example of confabulation, because if you look at the reports, it was a small kitchen fire, it was under control in 20 minutes, and it was not that big of a deal. You listen to Biden tell that story in Maui, firefighters were rushing in to save his cat and save Jill and all that. But one of the psychiatrists pointed out what they found so interesting about that story, whether it's true or not, it was an inappropriate story. It was a story that was tone deaf, and they said that might be a sign that in his brain, the mechanism to say, don't tell that story or don't say this isn't there. And that's why he thought, because there's nobody who thought that comparison was perfectly acceptable. And he even starts out, if you remember, not many people picked up on this, right before he tells the story, he's like, I'm not going to tell the story. And then he proceeds to tell the story.
Right. The other thing I've seen him do repeatedly, and this is not a direct family member, but this is like a friend of a family of my own acquaintance, talked about having cared for a family member, I don't want to get into the details, but just a relation who had dementia, and this person was always anxious to answer questions the right way. So they would solicit, well, what do you want me to say? How am I supposed to do this? What's the next step? They were seeking direction and guidance from the people that were talking to them, because they had this feeling that they had to do the right thing or perform at a certain level. And I've seen Biden do that, where he talks about what questions he's supposed to answer and who he's supposed to call on next. And he seems like he's seeking the same sort of guidance as this dementia patient was doing.
Yeah, he was traveling somewhere, and he was asked a question, and he was like, well, they told me not to answer it.
Right.
And I didn't
that he's going to get in trouble, or someone's going to yell at him about what he did or didn't do.
And I just wanted to ask, and nobody's ever asked him this question, who are they?
Yeah.
Who are they that they're going to? Well, one of the things I find really interesting, too, is during the few press conferences he has, which are few and far between.
As opposed to his predecessor, who would on the fly do 40-minute stand-ups outside the helicopter and just answer any question under the sun. I mean, the difference is diametrically opposed. Biden is never available or rarely available for the press, and Trump was a nonstop press machine.
Well, two things with that. One is, I've seen presidential press conferences with Obama's done this and Trump has done this, where they're told who to call on. And they make the effort of acting like it was their decision to call on this reporter.
Right.
And that they know who this reporter is, when it's obvious they don't know who the reporter is. And they don't know why they're calling on him other than they were told.
It's stage managed by the press office.
But Biden will come out, and there's no pretense there. Well, they told me to call on this reporter. And I find that so interesting that that has to go back to whatever neurological issues he's dealing with, that he doesn't even seem to want to play that game of pretending it was his decision and he made the decision to call on this person.
Again, it goes back to this idea of wanting to satisfy the person who's providing direction, and they're trying to answer or trying to obey what they've been told to do. Well, again, this is a situation where it isn't funny and it isn't frustrating. This is really sad and dangerous, in my estimation. I don't know how his family allows him to be put in that position. I mean, that's the other thing that's disturbing to me. Why would you do this to a man? He's clearly not at the top of his game, but for whatever reason, he's being sort of used like a puppet. I mean, it's very disturbing.
Well, what's concerning is if you look at the qualifications to carry the nuclear football and to have access to the nuclear football, you do have to undergo now, I don't know whether the president has or has not undergone this, but you are required to undergo a cognitive test to have access to that. And there's a lot of, even the slight hint of certain issues, certain health issues, will disqualify you from being able to carry or being involved in the nuclear football. For example, I know the president doesn't drink, but any hint of alcoholism or a drinking issue disqualifies somebody from being involved in the nuclear football.
Sure.
And they
used to call it PRP, Personal Reliability Program.
Exactly.
That was the old acronym for it.
Yeah, I think now it's something much more politically correct.
I'm sure, but that's what it was.
That's exactly right.
Yeah. So let me ask you another question. We've been going down this path of questioning fitness. Has anyone ever brought up 25th Amendment issues to the White House spokesperson? It was a nonstop question for Trump. There were conspiracies of everyone, they need to declare him unfit or crazy. Does anyone bring that up with respect to Biden, 25th Amendment, and all the issues we've been talking about?
No, you never hear that being brought up. And yes, it was brought up repeatedly under the Trump administration. I don't want to get the wrong official, but I know there was one of his cabinet members, I believe, had brought it up. Yes, it was brought up repeatedly in the Trump administration. It is not being brought up under the Biden administration at all. And it's funny because even when you see the brief calls for cognitive tests, the only two people who've ever really seemed like they're pushing that issue are Ronnie Jackson, the congressman from Texas, and Nikki Haley, who's running for Republican. Nobody else ever seems to be even pushing that cognitive test.
And Ronnie Jackson actually has a medical background and had been White House surgeon, I believe. So he has sort of he has credentials to ask that question or raise that issue.
Yes.
Yeah. So consistent with your reporting, just today, Associated Press poll with somebody else involved, I don't know who it was, but AP was part of the polling question, came out and asked questions about Biden's fitness based on his age to continue as president. Some remarkable results. The overall percentage, 77% of Americans did not have faith or confidence in him continuing as president, strictly based on his age and his sort of, I guess, the perception of his ability to perform. 77% said no. Of that, 89% are Republicans, no surprise there. But the real shocker to me, 69% of Democrats were of the opinion that Biden was unfit. Is that the consensus? It's probably unfair to ask you about your colleagues. What's the mood in the White House press room about numbers like that?
Well, the mood is, it's interesting, is that this administration just keeps ignoring them, and then they keep setting things up to try to disprove it. If you notice, and this didn't get a lot of coverage, but the White House really wanted it to get a lot of coverage, did you notice on his vacation in Lake Tahoe, he did a Pilates class? And then he did a Pilates class, I believe, in Rehoboth Beach about a week ago. And after the bike, remember when they put him on the bike and he crashed,
right.
and then suddenly he wasn't on a bike anymore? It seems like Pilates is the new way of trying to prove he's healthy. And that seems to be the way that they're countering this by setting up these staged photograph opportunities for people to photograph him doing something that you could then make the argument he's fit and vigorous.
Right. The beach photos were not flattering.
Yeah, but that's what I was going to say.
That was some of those photos. I don't want to draw the conclusion. People can look at them themselves, but they are horrendous.
Well, they seem to underscore how old. They seem to underscore his age more than they do to rebut his age, is what I'll say about these stage photo opportunities. And I find it so interesting because, they're set up because it seems like the president's PR team, nothing terrifies them more than an image showing he's old or an image showing that, he's not as fit.
He looks feeble. I mean,
yes.
Even the gait of his walk and his sort of this wandering that he does, where they need to sort of direct him or corral him to go in a certain direction. There's several different video shots of his son Hunter kind of swooping in and taking him by the arm and steering him around. They've got to be, any public movement like that, they've got to be terrified of what could come out of it.
Well, it's interesting because take your child to work day. He got stumped on questions from a bunch of kids. That's what I was so fascinated by. And then they abruptly ended it. They asked him to name his grandkids. He couldn't name how many. And I'm not even talking about Hunter's out-of-wedlock child in Navy that they pretend doesn't exist. Even the ones that he acknowledges, he was struggling to remember how many he had. They asked him where the last place he traveled to, and his answer was the last place I traveled to was the last place I traveled to, because he couldn't remember. And then one of the kids brought up Ireland, and he's like, oh, yes, Ireland. They asked him what his favorite movie is. The answer, I figured this out, was Top Gun 2, but his response was the one with the guy who flies the airplanes.
This is really disturbing. I mean, like I said, part of it makes you want to laugh, part of it's frustrating, but really when you get past those initial kind of, tweet, meme kind of ha-ha reactions, it's a real grave threat in my view. It's a very dangerous situation that we're facing. I don't know. I mean, what this really goes to. I mean, you've had the courage to write a story like this on confabulation. I'm going to drive to the area of some of your colleagues. Just seem to sit there and take dictation. They're stenographers. They're not reporters.
Well, one of the things I am starting to wonder is if he really is the candidate in 2024. I do, because I'm seeing some signs here that really make me wonder. One of them is the complete and sudden avoidance of the press. I went out with the president to the West Coast. We did Grand Canyon, Albuquerque, in Salt Lake City, and that was a 4-day trip with the president. He never engaged with us once, and we were told, we were told he wants to engage with you. We're working on a time. Never engaged with us at all. You saw, I went to about a month earlier. I went to Colorado. That was the trip where he fell. We were told he would do a gaggle with us before he gets on Air Force One. Then he fell, and then suddenly the gaggle was off. It seems that avoidance of the press. When the Senator Casey's mom passed away, he did a gaggle, and he came up to the reporters and told the reporters, I'm only talking about Senator Casey's mom. I think it was Elaine. I'm only talking about Elaine Casey. I'm not answering questions about anything else. And that put the reporters in a tough position, because if you ask him a question about anything else, he's going to walk away, and then you've blown your shot at getting anything from the president. Right. At the same time, what are you going to ask him about Elaine Casey? I mean,
it's very limited. Right?
Yeah. He thinks she's a nice person because he went to her funeral.
So stepping down one notch to the vice president, have you had much involvement in covering Vice President Harris and interacting with her?
I have. And just one other thing I want to just say to my earlier point about signs that he's not, that I wonder about, is the disinterest we saw in Maui. And not just in Maui in general, but from this administration, that they were late to respond. When they did respond, they, he goes to Maui and he pets a dog and he tells a weird story about it. And one of the things that I think underscores this that nobody's talked about with this administration's disinterest in Hawaii is in the press briefing, Karine Jean-Pierre butchered the name of both Hawaiian senators and then referred to Mazie Hirono as a he when Mazie Hirono's a she.
She is not the sharpest knife in the drawer by any stretch of the imagination. But I mean, she, in my view, she's unqualified for the position just based on her ability to do the basic job functions. I mean, it's embarrassing. You watch and it's another situation where watching her do her job is extraordinarily frustrating.
But nothing says we could care less more than not having your press secretary bother to learn the names of a state where it just had a major disaster, or even what gender they are. That's 2 minutes on Google. There's no excuse for that, and it just reeked. We could care less. And you match that up with East Palestine. I mean, March he told us he's going to East Palestine. We're what? A week out of September?
Right.
How many times has he flown over East Palestine on his way to a fundraiser in Colorado or a fundraiser in Utah?
Exactly.
But to me, that's another sign that makes me question, because I feel like somebody running would have bent over backwards for Hawaii, and we just didn't see that here.
Yeah, and I've seen people who are very angry about the administration's response to Maui and saying, gee, if we had only had enough Ukrainian flags, we could have raised the Ukrainian flag, and suddenly there would have been not $700 given to people, but think of the hundreds of billions of dollars, or actually 130 billion, I guess, to Ukraine. But I want to go back into the White House press pool there, that White House briefing room. My impression, outside looking in, is that it's enormously dysfunctional, that there's a lot of weirdness going on in that room, both from the administration standpoint and how they interact with and treat reporters, but even among the press there. It is the strangest thing I've seen. I've been in Washington a long time, but right now it seems like at the most dysfunctional and bizarre set of circumstances going. What is going on in the White House press?
Well, specific, what strangeness are you? I mean, there's a lot, but I just want to know. There's so much. I just want to make sure I answer which strangeness are you referring to?
I guess, one situation is there's a number of reporters who are basically being canned because the White House Press Association is changing the rules or the requirements, so there's fewer members of the press.
We can absolutely get into that.
There's just the interaction and sort of the stonewalling of Karine Jean-Pierre and her interactions with you and your colleagues. There's a remarkable lack of intellectual curiosity. Like I said, most of your colleagues are stenographers. They just take dictation. They don't ask real questions. I mean, I could go on.
I could get into all of that. Is there a specific area you want me to start with? I could address all that.
I'll leave it to you. You're the one who works there.
Okay. Well, let's start with the press poll.
Yeah.
Let's start with the press badges. So there's a couple of things there. What it is, so let me explain it to the people who are watching, is back in May, the White House suddenly announced that anybody who has a White House badge now has to reapply for their White House badge. And they have attached a strict set of stipulations to qualify. One of the ones I thought was most interesting is that you have to live in the D.C., Maryland, Virginia area, but they never specify what that means. Like if I lived in Baltimore, would I qualify? If I lived in Norfolk, which I guess is a little too far, but
I mean, you can live on the edge of West Virginia even.
Yeah, exactly. And another thing that I find really interesting is that you also have to be pre-credentialed by the House or Senate, because it's a little tougher to be credentialed in the House and the Senate than it is in the White House, which probably surprises most people. But they actually are a little more strict on who they give access to. There are some people who have raised the issue, including one of the reporters, which I can get into, who's has not had his press badge renewed, arguing that that is a violation of the Constitution because you have the White House referring to the House and the Senate. It's the executive branch deferring to the legislative branch. And as we know, that's not the case. The executive branch is always in charge, well, for the most part, is in charge of the legislative branch. So that's sort of interesting. What they're doing here, so I will say this. In the first couple of months since they started doing this and started renewing it, I believe roughly 500, I think it's 450 people roughly have not had their badges renewed. That's roughly a third of all the press badges out there. What they're doing, why they're doing this, is there's a reporter, Simon Atiba, he's with Africa Daily News. He has not been called on, and that's something we can get into. What's prompting this is a lot of people are not getting called on in the briefing room on a regular basis because Corinne is afraid to go beyond the third row. Because he's not getting called on, he has taken the step of shouting out his questions.
So when you say go beyond the third row, so for our listeners and viewers, what's the third row and why is it magic to go past that?
Sure,
why is that dangerous?
Right. Sure. So the White House briefing room is, I think it's 5 or 6 rows. The first 3 are the legacy media, including the networks and the network outlets.
So sort of their captured, their pet.
Yes, exactly.
Media organs of the state.
Right. Now, what I found interesting is Jen Psaki was not afraid to go past the third row. Corinne rarely goes past the third row, and it's really interesting what they do to help her not cross that threshold. One is guests. I put out last week, who was it? She had Dina Criswell to come on and talk about what they were doing in Maui. And then it was somebody from OMB was coming out to talk about some, I believe, I don't want to say it wrong, but it was some administrative policy.
Some budgetary issue.
Some budgetary issue.
Right.
And it was, these briefings are 45 minutes to an hour, and she comes out and announces 2 guests, and I'm thinking, is she holding a press briefing or is she hosting The Tonight Show?
So she eats up her press availability time by bringing in outside spokespeople to discuss the flavor of the day.
Which Psaki did from time to time, but she did it when there was a reason to bring somebody out. And she didn't do it nearly as much as Corinne does. The other thing she'll do is there's a really interesting exchange. There was a very short Air Force One flight. And when the president travels, they'll do the gaggle on Air Force One instead of doing it in the briefing room because the press secretary, whoever it is, whether it's Sarah Sanders with Trump or Karine Jean-Pierre with Biden, they always go with the president. So then they'll do on it. There was a very short trip. I think he went to Philadelphia. The flight was about an hour. And she starts reading what the week ahead is going to be. And you hear the reporters say, because the White House will email us twice the week ahead. We get a detailed week ahead and we get a general week ahead. We'll get the email, please start answering our questions. And she's like, no, I've got to get through this. I've got to get through this. And she keeps reading the questions. And the other thing is she will give a long-winded answer when she's not supposed to do that.
Right. She's filibustering.
Yeah, exactly.
That's basically what it is.
There was an example when the president went to Ireland. Hunter Biden came with him. And somebody asked, when the president's family, whoever the president is, when they travel with the president, they have to pay their own way. And it was a simple question of whether Hunter Biden paid his own way or not. And she almost got herself into trouble because she's giving this long-winded answer about the history of the law that requires presidential families to pay their own way. And the simple answer is either yes, he did, or no, he didn't, but he's paying us. It's not a complicated answer. And she's giving this lecture on the history, and I found it interesting. You can't be bothered to find out whether Mazie Hirono is male or female, but all of a sudden you know everything there is to know about the law that requires the president's family.
Yeah, I mean, I get the impression that somebody just winds her up and then pushes her out in front of the camera, and she's really on thin ice, and she's got her briefing book, and that's pretty much the extent of her media savvy. I mean, she's very limited, it seems to me.
Well, and she sparked a conspiracy theory a couple months ago when she turned to the wrong page in her briefing book, and then announced that she was at the wrong page, and that led a lot. And I don't know whether this is true or not, but it led a lot of people to speculate whether or not she was getting the questions beforehand. I will tell you, that I know a reporter who's with a top publication, and
yeah, that's fine.
And it's a publication that would surprise you is not getting questions in the briefing room, and they went over 9 months without getting a question in until they started emailing her, not their question, but emailing her this is what I like to talk about in the briefing room. And that is what it took for them to get a question. And it's a publication that you would think would get a question in.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the legacy media organizations are essentially in the tank for them anyway. They're never going to ask a tough question. They're just there to take dictation. But what it ends up doing is it creates this really bizarre Orwellian scenario in the newsroom or in the White House press room. And I don't think, or I'm not sure that the public realizes how badly they're being served by what's going on there.
Well, it goes beyond that. I'll give you, one of the things I find really interesting is all the TV outlets are there. And they all need the clip of their reporter asking Corinne that question. Right. And they all have the same question. So if you watch like CBS, ABC, and NBC, 9 times out of 10, they'll ask the same question with just different words because they don't want to show CBS doesn't want to show the clip of the ABC reporter. So it's her getting the same question 4 different times. One of the things I find really interesting, back to my point about Simon and the effort to sort of silence him.
And this is Simon Atebe, A-T-E-B-A.
Yes, with Africa Today News. One of the things I find so interesting is everybody's outraged over him. Earlier this month, one of the reporters, a reporter who sits in the front row, which is where the top media sits, asked her if she saw Barbie over the weekend. That's what they use their time to ask her for. We all get our time, we can use it whatever we want. That's what they chose. Nothing. We're all supposed to be okay with that. But then Simon is not getting questions. He's decided to take matters in his own hands. He's decided to press them on the fact that they're not calling on him, and he becomes public enemy number 1. But somebody's asking her if she saw Barbie, and we're all supposed to be okay with that. I find that bizarre.
There's really a lack of sort of intellectual rigor or honesty, it seems like. Is there a way that the White House press corps sort of polices itself where someone can say, hey, look, I understand that you've got your own agenda and your own editorial view on things. Okay, fine. But don't waste my time with idiot questions about Barbie. I mean, is there some venue where White House reporters get together and say, I get it, you're in the tank for them, but that's not the issue. You're burning time. You're not letting legitimate questions go forward.
These have been brought up. The fact that she's very rarely goes beyond the 3rd row has been brought up so many times at White House Correspondent Association meetings.
Right.
And it's always met with, we're trying, we're asking, we're bringing this up to her, and ultimately she's going to do what she wants. We have no control or authority over her.
At what point does she become the issue? Instead of, the reporters don't want to be the story, right? The reporters want to be able to report. They don't want to become the story. What happens if she becomes the story?
Well, I think that's a matter of time with these briefings. I mean, now with these gaffes. Now it's kind of comical. She keeps calling, for whatever reason, she keeps calling Marjorie Taylor Greene Majority Taylor Greene. She's made that mistake more than once. I don't know why, but I suspect there might be a time where she goes off to the campaign and John Kirby comes in. Because that's something we have not talked about, is this administration bringing in John Kirby, for the only reason I can think of is to basically babysit her. John Kirby comes in, he's willing to move around the room, which is something else. And I'm kind of moving around here.
That's fine.
But earlier I had brought up the guests.
Yeah.
One of the things that really galls me is, let's say we have the Secretary of Commerce come in or Dina Criswell come in. So what they'll do is Corinne, and Psaki did this too, but both did this, they'll point to the reporters that they want them to call on. And so they'll call on the reporters, and then, which these people also, by the way, they head a federal agency. They can stand and point. It's not complicated. But she insists on pointing on who they call. So then the person leaves, takes up, say, 20 minutes out of an hour briefing. And then she just goes back and calls on the same people who already got their question in, which is what's so frustrating when she rarely goes beyond the 3rd row. And now these people are getting 2 questions per briefing. And that's That's very frustrating. I do wonder if there's going to be a time where they decide, they put out some statement that they find that she's better fit for the campaign and John Kirby's taking over. Olivia Dalton, who was her number 2, has also gotten high marks for her press briefings when she has filled in. A lot of the reporters, and I've seen some media talk about what a good, but I think in the end it goes to Kirby because he is doing a better job. But here's something else that
Kirby, interestingly though, I mean, so Corinne Jean-Pierre, if she gets in a tough spot, just kind of goes to pieces and quits. That's my impression. Kirby becomes more combative and exasperated, which I think is an interesting difference in sort of his personality or his interaction with the press, where he's been asked questions where he clearly demonstrates his frustration and exasperation with anyone daring to ask him a question.
I would agree with that. But at the same time, he also finds a way to provide something. There is something quotable in his answers. There is something you can take away. And he's not, he doesn't have a binder. He's not, he's not flipping through his binder desperately trying to come up with an answer for you.
Right.
But they've also boxed themselves into a corner because they keep trumping her as the first LGBTQ press secretary, the first African American press secretary, and the last thing they want to be seen as doing is scuttling that. And, not in support of these communities that have come out in droves for the Biden administration. And they've really backed themselves into a corner.
This is identity politics that is just, it's off the rails. It actually serves as sort of the worst example of what they are trying to disprove, which is, that's the great irony in all of this.
Well, and they're always lecturing us about freedom of press. They're always lecturing us about how much they support the freedom of press. And you trot out a press secretary who doesn't want to go beyond the third row. You have a president who repeatedly avoids the media, or says to him, I'm only going to answer your questions if you ask me about this. If you ask me about something else, I'm going to walk away.
Right.
So it rings hollow how much they talk to us and lecture us about freedom of press.
Jeff Mordock, White House correspondent for the Washington Times. Before we close out, I'm going to give you the last word. What is something that our viewing and listening audience has no idea, they have no appreciation of, but that they really need to know is going on with the White House?
Oh man, you put me on the spot.
Yeah, I did.
So many things.
Or something close.
Give me a minute here to think of something that they should know about.
Because there's a lot of Kabuki Theater. There's a lot of stuff that goes on that looks like it's normal, but it's not. I've told a friend of mine and even an intern here, go up and go sit in a House or a Senate hearing. What you see on television is not really what's going on in the room. So maybe there's something like that.
See, I feel like most that I've already gotten out. So
Sure.
let me try to think. I think here. Okay. Here's just the only reason this popped in my head is because we were talking about press access and what's going on in the briefing room. So I'll share this. I am struck by, in the briefing room, when Jake Tapper was pulling his shenanigans under Trump and interrupting people and talking over, how much support he got. Now, when Simon does that in the briefing room, how much he's shushed, how much he's shouted down by other reporters, how little support there is. And it somewhat baffles me that people who talk about freedom of press are not coming out and being more supportive of him. That is something that I think fascinates me, especially because nobody seemed to care that somebody asked Corinne about Barbie, whether or not she saw Barbie.
That is an excellent point. So. If you're from one segment of the media, you're applauded and told you're marvelous and wonderful and everyone supports you. If you're from another angle in the media, you're hushed and shouted down and somehow some sort of an enemy for daring to ask questions. That's very insightful, very helpful. So, Jeff, thank you very much for coming in.
Thank
we
you
really
for having
appreciate
me.
it.
Thank you.
Please be sure to subscribe and share the good news about On Watch with your friends. If you enjoy this kind of discussion, this kind of detailed reporting on what's really going on, we encourage you to subscribe, leave us a rating. I'm Chris Farrell, On Watch.